So, picking back up on the last part of our section on social exchange, don't forget your activity 6 is due Friday at 11:59 p.m. Your outline 11 is also due Friday at 11:59 p.m. And remember, the outline 11 is from last week. So, make sure that you're listening to the lectures, you're looking over the slides, and you're creating your outline and submitting that this Friday. Uh, Make sure to complete the assigned reading. It's a quick and easy read. I think it's a really fun reading. The reading is actually like that particular journal is designed, all the readings are designed to be more accessible. It's a quick, easy read. I think it's really fun and really interesting. And then your quiz 6 will be due Friday at 11:59 p.m. I didn't push back the due date for this one because I want us to just stay on track so that you guys can just get these assignments out of the way. I think you've had plenty of time for activity 6 and that week 11 outline. But just to give you a little bit of extra leeway, I made it so that you could take the quiz twice. Now, of course, it's not going to show you the correct answers, but it will show you, I believe, the answers that were incorrect. So you at least have, if anything, you have the opportunity to see the quiz, get a feel for it, and take it a second time. And then outline 12, so the one for this week, will be due Sunday at 11:59 p.m. And again, that's just to give you a little bit of extra breathing room so it's a little less stressful kind of getting caught up after the ice storm. And make sure to watch the supplementary videos for this week. I think they're really helpful in terms of giving you some more context and understanding of social exchange, its origins, and its applications. So, today we're going to discuss some of the applications and critiques of social exchange theory. So, these are just some select examples from traditional and some more contemporary research on social exchange. The first example of applications is on customer loyalty. So, social exchange creates a sense of shared responsibility for service outcomes, resulting in greater emotions. So, when emotions are positive, there should be increased loyalty to the service provider. And so, again, this is just from some of the studies on customer loyalty using a social exchange framework and how it creates a sense of shared responsibility for service outcomes. So thinking like, you go into I don't know, AT&T or something to discuss like your phone and maybe your phone broke or you are getting a new one. And so because you're exchanging with that, one particular representative, you're doing, you're answering questions, you're saying these are some things that I want, things that I don't want. Sometimes there's a bit of compromise. And so it creates this sense of shared responsibility for service outcomes, resulting in, typically more positive emotions or at least heightened emotions. And so when these emotions are positive, there should be increased loyalty to the service provider. So once that exchange is over with, you had a positive experience, even if it, didn't go perfectly smoothly. Sometimes, going to like AT&T or something, you have to sit there for a while and, things take time. But if it were a positive experience, that tends to increase levels of customer loyalty. And then there are some studies on punishment. So many social exchange theorists argue that actual use of punishment in exchange relations results in the following outcomes. So traditionally, this is what they believe is a result of punishment in social exchange. They say that it provokes hostility, provokes retaliation, and decreases mutually rewarding exchange. So many social exchange theorists argue that the actual use of punishment in exchange relations provokes these feelings of hostility and retaliation, and can even lead to a decrease rather than an increase in mutually rewarding exchange. And so we're going to review a couple of examples of this. So, in contrast, some of the more contemporary studies of punishment and exchange, and again, punishment doesn't necessarily have to be um, it doesn't necessarily have to be something extreme. It could be like, of course, it could be like reprimanding somebody, sanctioning them in some way. So, like ignoring them um, could be a sanction, could be considered a punishment. There's, punishments could be like someone has to pay a fee or a fine or something. There's a variety of different things we mean when we specifically talk about punishments. But some of the more contemporary studies on social exchange and punishment within those exchanges investigated contingent punishment. So it being dependent on particular um, aspects of the exchange, of the nature of that relationship. And they found the following: that more frequent contingent punishment, it actually increases the effectiveness of punishment power. So if there's more frequent instances of punishment, but it's contingent specifically on, let's say, certain desired behaviors, and you're frequently punishing or sanctioning undesirable behavior, they found that it tends to increase the effectiveness of that punishment power because it's more frequent. Although the motivation to minimize loss constrains the use of punishment. So, right, like consistently putting out, frequently punishing and sanctioning someone else in an exchange relationship can certainly result in a lot of loss for that individual, which constrains um, the motivation to inflict punishments or sanctions on the other. Um, More frequent punishment for non-exchange increases the partner's reward exchange without increasing retaliation or a negative affect. So more frequent punishment specifically for non-exchange. So for someone, not engaging in an exchange with you, it actually increases the partner's reward exchange without increasing retaliation or negative affect. And so these are some things to keep in mind. So, like I said, initially you had some of the more traditional studies on punishment that said it provokes hostility, retaliation, and decreases mutually rewarding exchange. But some of the more contemporary investigations into punishment suggest that if it's frequent, but contingent, so contingent on very specific dimensions of behavior or exchange or whatever the case may be, it tends to be more effective. However, the desire to reduce loss in that relationship kind of constrains the motivation to inflict punishment or sanctions. And more frequent punishment for non exchange can actually increase the partner's reward exchange without increasing retaliation. So they've taken what these traditional theorists have done with punishment and they've expanded on that and found that while this might be true more generally, when we look at it in more specific situations, we're seeing that that's not necessarily the case across all types of exchange or all exchange relations or across context. So, some other things that they found is that um, punishment that was both strong and consistent produced the highest frequency of reward exchange and the least negative affect toward the partner. So that means that punishment that was strong, so very clear, strong punishment, and consistent in terms of its frequency and its application, produced the highest frequency of reward exchange and the least negative affect towards the partner. So being like strong and clear in your punishment or sanction, but also consistent in terms of when and how it's applied and to whom. So one of the things they found is that the probability of punishment for undesirable responses must be greater than the probability of punishment for desirable responses. The greater the difference, the more effective the strategy of punishment. So, for example, let's think about a teacher in a classroom. So a teacher in a classroom has to, especially like with younger kids, it's really important that you want to encourage, positive behavior that you consider desirable. And it's important to, set boundaries and sanction students when they're doing something that is very much undesirable, very disruptive, or even like harmful or dangerous. But you want to be careful because, especially like with young children, for example, um, it might not always look the way you want it to look. So you have to be careful not to like punish or sanction behavior that is actually desirable. So, like, for example, let's say there's a student who you really want to engage to think critically, and the student, is speaking up in class and trying to answer questions and maybe asking a ton of questions, why, over and over. Um, and, the teacher might get frustrated, but it's really important not to punish or sanction that behavior because it's actually desirable behavior, right? The student's engaging, the student is thinking critically. It's just more so of how the students going about it, and that's something that takes time, but you have to be careful not to punish that or sanction that actual positive desirable behavior. Um, and so um, instead they must punish students um, or apply sanctions specifically when necessary and consistent. So things that are truly undesirable behavior or negative behavior, so that they don't, discourage students from things that are actually positive and desirable. So they have to instead make sure that they're being consistent in terms of their only sanctioning behavior that is undesirable. And then they found that the intensity of punishment also matters. So, a high probability of strong punishment produced less negative affect because it quickly produced compliance, allowing the relation to change from one of coercion to one of mutually beneficial exchange. So, what they're saying here is, again, like, we'll stick with the like student and teacher in a classroom example. So, if a student is behaving badly in a classroom, the teacher must respond, and this is like behaving badly, disruptive, harmful, maybe even dangerous. The parent, excuse me, the teacher has to respond pretty strongly and immediately and clearly. Like, this is absolutely not acceptable, and that has to be clear and immediate, um, without any hesitation. It has to be something that is immediately addressed. Um, and when it says like intensity of punishment, like a strong punishment, that doesn't necessarily mean like strong in terms of like it's really bad and it could just be like a strong, uh, reprimanding. This is absolutely not acceptable. Like you have to stop, and that depends on context and situations in terms of what's appropriate and what's considered a strong punishment. And so they found that again, like if, for example, students behaving badly, the teacher must respond with a strong punishment or sanction. It has to be consistent. So the teacher it has to be specifically behavior that is undesirable, and it has to be consistent, applied consistently. So the teacher also can't play favorites. It has to be, for all students. And this is because if a student is acting badly, a stronger punishment, like let's say like a timeout, like being reprimanded and getting a timeout, it immediately demands compliance. And so because of this, it creates this. It goes from a relationship, one of coercion, of you must comply, I'm asking you to comply, to one of mutually beneficial exchange. And this is because like you know this, reprimanding might immediately demand compliance. And because of this, there tends to be fewer hard feelings because once the student complies, it's mutually beneficial for both the teacher and the student. So the teacher will reward the student for complying. Um, and it's also, rewarding for the student to comply because they're being rewarded by the teacher. And then, it's just good for everyone in the situation because that behavior has been stopped and everyone has a mutual understanding and is working together to bring about, a more positive and stable environment or whatever the case may be. And then finally, they found that the frequency of exchange matters. So even though strong coercion resulted in subjects exchanging more often with a less valuable partner, the frequency of that reward exchange made them feel more positive towards the less valued partner. So, for example, let's say you have an acquaintance, someone that you are in someone that you work with, for example, and so you see them all the time. You spend a lot of time with them because you work together, and maybe it's not somebody that you would necessarily choose as a friend, and maybe they wouldn't necessarily choose you if you weren't, spending a ton of time together. But because you're seeing them so often and so regularly, and you tend to have, pretty rewarding exchanges with them, um, it, you know, you tend to start feeling more positively toward them because even though this person you wouldn't consider like your absolute best friend or like your favorite friend, you're seeing them often, you're having positive exchanges, it tends to foster a more positive emotions towards them. And so again, what we found, and that situation specifically doesn't address like punishment and coercing someone into like being your friend, but just as an example, in terms of like that frequency of exchange can foster more positive emotions. And you can apply that to a situation where punishment is used in terms of like a coercive power within an exchange. So, again, these three things are what they found to be important in terms of punishment and exchange. The reason for the punishment matters, the intensity of the punishment matters, and the frequency of exchange also is important. And so, for cooperation, one study investigated two structural variations on dyadic exchange and cooperation. The first structural variation they looked at was dependence and interdependence. So, the extent to which one person's rewards are contingent on another's behavior, either completely, which is dependence, or partially, which is interdependence. And then the second structural variation was on exchange and cooperation. So so essentially the correlation of reward opportunities of members of interdependent dyads, either uncorrelated, so social exchange, or positively correlated cooperation. So researchers investigated how these structural variations on dyadic exchange and cooperation, and the results indicate a strong effect of dependence and interdependence, meaning dependent dyads seldom exchanged. Um, Dependent dyads seldom maintained exchange in the presence of an individual alternative, meaning that because there's a lot of risk and uncertainty involved when you're wholly dependent on an exchange partner for these rewards. It tends to feel a bit more coerced because you neither of you really have a choice whether or not you want to protect the other's interests. It's essentially like you're simply engaging in it to get what you need, and you're not doing it out of the goodness of your heart. You're not doing it because you want to. You're doing it because you have to, because you're dependent. And so it tends to create more risk, more uncertainty, and less trust within that relationship. And so it's seldom maintained in the presence of alternatives. And so most interdependent dyads, however, so there's more alternatives, maintain exchange in the presence of an individual alternative. And again, that's because despite there's still a pretty high level of risk and uncertainty, it doesn't seem to feel as coerced. Because there are alternatives, it feels more like it was each person's own idea to cooperate. So you're not doing it because you have to. You're not doing it out of necessity. You're doing it because you want to actually engage in exchange with this person. So cooperation um, tended to be something you see more in these interdependent dyads, where people feel like it's where they're not coerced into exchanging, and the other person isn't coerced into exchanging. That they're doing it because they genuinely want to exchange with this person. And so here is a video I've linked in here on the prisoner's dilemma. I highly recommend watching it. It's something we've discussed a few times over the semester, and I think it will be really helpful in terms of understanding, particularly the application of social exchange theory and kind of the foundation of that application.
Let's say
Whoop,
Mr. Blue.
nope. Okay, there we go. So moving on to some critiques, and these are some of the most prominent assessments and critiques of social exchange theory. So, the first being that social exchange theory is too simplistic, that it reduces human behavior to rational calculation of cost versus benefits, that it reduces, our behavior to this rational calculation. It assumes, first of all, the actors are rational, that we are making these decisions in a rational manner, and that it can't account for altruism, that it assumes that we are all self-interested, and if we're all self-interested, then we can't be altruistic. So, they think that it's too simplistic, it's very reductionist, it reduces us to just like these human calculators who have no capacity for selflessness, um, or, it also assumes that we're incredibly rational, which, as we've discussed in the past, may or may not be the case. So it very much depends on the conceptualization of the actor. Is the actor rational or not? They also say that social exchange theory is perhaps too subjective. So there's no reliable or standardized way of determining value. Um, and so it assumes the value of cost and rewards and resources, and that it assumes that they can't be gauged because it's too subjective. That, as they say, like, uh, one person's trash is another person's treasure. Like, it's too subjective in terms of what's considered a reward and what's considered a punishment. And they also said that their perception of equity determines if actors continue a relationship, but not actual equity within a particular exchange relationship. And so they say that there's too much perception involved. There's too much, this subjective perception of what is good, what is valuable, what is a reward, what's a cost, what's a punishment, what's, fair. We talked about distributive justice, equity, fairness. That's all coming down to perception, essentially, which is, you can see these, two different critiques, how they in some ways overlap, but also kind of contradict one another. Because on the one hand, it's saying that, everything is much too subjective, and it's much too subjective. There's too many moving parts, and people are, you know, taking these consideration across different situations. But on the other hand, like, humans are reduced to being, they're selfish, they're self interested. There's no room for altruism. And it says that humans are rational when they're not. But at the same time, like, take into consideration all these different subjective rewards and costs, and being able to operate relatively effectively across exchange relationships would assume some, pretty high degree of rationality. So again, these critiques in some ways overlap and in some ways contradict each other. But some of the strengths of social exchange theory. One is that social exchange theory provides an analytical approach to social phenomena extending beyond, mere sociological concerns. The exchange traditions emphasizes how the social processes are foundational to social structure and social change. And so one point that I really wanted to highlight here, it's one particular aspect of exchange theory serves as both a strength and a weakness, and that is the minimalist conception of the actor. So, while actors are assumed to be self interested, few other restrictions are placed on or assumed of the actor. But this allows for conceptualizations of actors to be individuals or groups acting as individual entities. So, conceptualizing actors as individuals or groups of individuals acting as individual entities not only extends the perspective beyond its initial limitations, but it allows theorists to incorporate actors across all levels of the social world. And so, this is one of the biggest critiques of exchange theory. It's minimalist conception of the actor. And in many ways, it can be a weakness because, they assume that people are rational. We assume that people are self interested, that we're just, calculating these costs and rewards. And it can't account for altruism. But on the same note, it's a strength of the theory because it's very consistent, but also um, it allows for so much expansion in terms of how we can apply this theory into what types of social phenomena and across all different levels of the social world. So it's something that's very well suited for at to be adapted in terms of like it can be used on the micro level, it can be used um, the meso level, right? So across like institutions and organizations, and perhaps it's something that we could even see on the macro level, like maybe like international relations. So between different countries, for example, or different governing across different governing bodies. So it's something that you don't really see often, particularly in sociological theory and especially in social psychology. It's not something you see where there are theories that can be applied across different levels of the social world to understand these types of behaviors, these exchanges between individuals or groups. Alternatively, the minimalist conception of the actor presents challenges unique to social exchange theory. So, while social exchange theory has its origins in economics, where rational choice theory is quite popular, it assumes that reason underlies the decision making process. And this conception disregards the influence of social processes on effective attachment, relational cohesion, commitment, solidarity, and trust. So, thinking back to our section on affect and emotion, it doesn't necessarily leave room for things like emotion and affect and these types of positive feelings we feel towards one another, like group solidarity, and how that might influence our ability to exchange or the nature of those exchanges. And finally, is there room for altruism? So, altruism refers to the unselfish regard for or devotion to the welfare of others, lacks concern for one's own advantage, pleasure, or well being. So, in studies simulating the prisoner's dilemma, players cooperate more with in group members than with out group members. And there are two explanations of why shared group membership promotes cooperation in social dilemmas, which is something we'll cover next week. Shared group membership reduces greed, but not fear, and thus should promote altruistic behavior toward in group members in the absence of fear. But also, altruistic behavior toward in group members is, the ticket to enter this generalized exchange system. So people are not predicted to behave altruistically when it is made salient that no system of generalized exchange operates within the group. So, um, for example, um, let's say, okay, so social exchange. So we tend to help others if it benefits us or the rewards are greater than the cost, right? Because it assumes that we're self interested. But we kind of account for this in some way with the reciprocity norm, which encourages us to help those who have helped us in the past. And some, like I said, some factors that might promote altruism are shared group membership, generalized exchange systems. So that meaning like um, you understand once you're aware of this more generalized exchange system where you can reap benefits by putting something in, you might be more likely to reciprocate or act in quotes altruistically. Um, you could think of things like vicarious rewards. So you do something for someone, it makes them feel good, and therefore it makes you feel good. Um, and there's some also moral reasoning standpoints. So you might think of it like I'm supposed to behave a certain way. I'm supposed to be charitable and philanthropic or compassionate or selfless or whatever, altruistic, whatever word you want to use. And this is what I'm supposed to do, and I'm going to do it, even though I don't really want to do it. But instead, you do it because you feel like it's something you are obligated to do because it's part of your identity and who you are. So, again, that's a way you could incorporate identity theory. You can pull in affect and emotion. You can pull in social identity theory. There are a variety of ways you could look at this. And so, is there room for altruism? Well, the answer to that is maybe. It depends on how you think of altruism. Is it acting totally without any regard for the self? Well, then maybe not. Maybe it doesn't really leave room for that. But there are ways that we can at least observe people acting in ways that tend to benefit the other person more than it benefits them. So, regardless of the motivation for that, if we're just looking at altruism in terms of if we're defining it purely in behavioral terms, yes, it leaves room for altruistic behavior. Does it leave room for altruistic motivations? Well, probably not, but maybe. But again, like if we're looking at altruism in terms of behavioral and in behavioral terms, then yes, social exchange seems to leave room for altruistic behavior. Whether or not that's the motivation is perhaps not necessarily the point. Maybe in some situations it is. But that's something that you can think about. Does it leave room for altruism? Can we truly act selflessly without it's something, I think of a story that my dad told me when I was younger, and he talked about how his father made him go to a soup kitchen, and he had to serve at the soup kitchen for a while when he was young. And after my dad was finished, his dad asked him, "So what'd you think? Um, how'd it make you feel?" And my dad said, "Well, it made me feel good. Like I feel good that I got to help people, that I got to, serve others. And I feel good. I feel good that I got to be a part of that and that I got to help and that, people were being helped by what I was doing." And his dad looked at him and he said, "That's not the point. The point isn't to make you feel good about yourself. The point isn't to make you feel satisfied in your behavior and your service to others. The point is purely to serve others. It's not for you." And I think about that a lot in terms of this particular question. Is it possible for someone to truly have a motivation that isn't directed towards the self in some way? That's a tough question. I'm not sure really anybody can answer that. I think a lot of people have debated that for many years. But in terms of behavior, which is something that um, social exchange focuses on, yes, we can certainly see people behaving altruistically. Whether or not it's an altruistic motivation is perhaps not the point. Maybe the point here is their behavior is altruistic. They're behaving in a more selfless way. So yeah, I pose that question to you. What do you think? Do you think there's room for altruism and social exchange? Do you think people can not just behave altruistically, but have altruistic motivations? But other than that, that's all. Make sure to submit everything that's due this Friday, particularly quiz 6. And please reach out and let me know if you have any questions, comments, or concerns. Thanks.